It's, it's gatherings like this that make me, really, I won't say envious in a way, but just kind of wistful that I couldn't have, that, I'm coming in for one evening to talk with you, and here you are, a community dedicated to learning not just in the past, but in the future. So my title here was Your Foothold in the Renaissance. It was sort of one of those titles where Randy explained what this new endeavor is and said, why do people really need ideas? Why do people need to keep abreast? Why do business people need to keep learning new things? And the first thing I thought of was this guy. I don't usually talk about the Renaissance, but I was thinking about this man. He looks kind of like a kindly gentleman, right? His name is Elliot Jacks, or was Elliot Jacks. He passed away a few years ago. He was one of the great management thinkers of our time, right up there with W. Edwards Deming and Peter Drucker, Jay Forrester, really influential individual, or he would have been if he hadn't been such an infuriating person in his personality. And so difficult. And I was working with Peter Senge, and Peter Senge convened a group of the most eminent management thinkers around MIT at that time, at the MIT Sloan School, one day around 1998, so that this guy could come and talk to them. And he walked in, and these are like, this is like people like Edgar Schein, who was the authority on culture, and Chris Argyris, and who was the authority on management insight, and highly influential, skilled management theorists. And he walked in, and he opened by saying, management is in the same state today that the natural sciences were in the 17th century. Today, there is not one single well-established concept in the field of management on which you can build a testable theory. And then before this eminent group, he said, does anyone know what management is? No, of course not. Nobody does. Except for me. I do. That sort of set the tone for the evening, and he went on to actually talk through his theory, and he did, in fact, have a testable theory, which is really cool, and which I'll tell you about in a little while. But the point, the thing that I came away with, was realizing, my God, he's right. And, for a lot of people, I bet including some people in this room, management is in the 17th century. We're taking our precious organizations and we're putting them, well, we're bringing in people who, in effect, are barber surgeons. This is a painting, a contemporary painting of a 17th century practitioner of medicine in his barber shop, painted by Jos van Kruisbeek, who I'm sure pronounced his name exactly that way. And that was what passed for medical practice before the discovery of the circulation of the blood. And today you could argue that a lot of what we see under the name of business management insight is, people who come in with the organizational equivalent of leeches and phrenology, and if the organization improves, well, that shows that the method was intact and really good, and if the organization suffers and dwindles, well, nobody could have fixed it. There's a lot of it works, but a lot of it, sort of seems like folk wisdom and, not really provable and not really verifiable and not really all that scientific and, very well intentioned. But, if you were to say, well, I kind of suspect you feel the same way I do. If I have a choice with someone to operate on my organization, I'd rather, have the equivalent of someone who knows about the circulation of the blood and has some, sort of realistically some more powerful equipment and a little bit more experience and who understands what's going to happen. So if you're cynical about business management ideas, I don't blame you. And if you think the purpose of a degree is basically to get a job and thereafter you don't really need to worry about learning anything new, I don't blame you either. But I do think that's incorrect. Because just like this guy, we are, in fact, on the cusp of a renaissance in management, understanding, and in our understanding, management science, business theory, is not really that different from economics and psychology and sociology and political science, and they're all different aspects from different traditions of the study of the same thing, which is the study of human endeavor, individually and collectively. And business just happens to be one of those places where the study of human endeavor gets put to the test by the people who are studying it. Every business decision you make is a bet on some theory about the way the world works. Whether you are consciously betting on that theory or just making a decision because it feels like the right thing to do, you're betting on an idea. And you're betting on the fact that that idea is correct. And I'm going to explain what I mean with some examples in a few minutes. So, right now, there's a lot of people betting on ideas that they don't know very much about. And fortunately, many of those ideas are right enough that the businesses succeed and thrive. But not always, and not always in the right context. And a lot of business ideas are situation specific, and a lot of business ideas are, applicable only to a certain point and then aren't applicable and after that, as anyone who has shepherded a startup into success knows. Sooner or later, all the things that you thought were right to do at the early stages of the startup, well, now suddenly we need, somebody who knows about real large-scale management, and all the rules change. So, really what I came to talk about is the value of ideas. And you know how every time someone says, this time it's different, it turns out that it's just the same. Well, actually, this time I think it is different. And I wouldn't have said that 5 years ago. But then came artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things and sensors everywhere and processes that watch themselves and, automation, and surveillance of human activity. And this, by the way, I've already arranged that this slide deck will be posted on the group's webpage, so you'll have access to it, probably in a PDF form. So this slide is really here for my benefit, So basically, all of that stuff that's a lot of activity on artificial intelligence that's happening or is about to happen between now and 2025. And the bottom row, which is management, basically what companies do and what results they get down to a micro level, what customers do online and offline, what the purchaser does in a retail store if it's a consumer company, what the business buyer does if it's a business-to-business company, what the person running a plant does on the factory floor, and the various machines. All of that is going to be tracked and analyzed, if it isn't already, to an intense degree. So we're going to know, in the same way that somebody studying the human body knows about microbes and microorganisms in a way they never could have before all of that was tracked. We're going to know what happens in business. We're going to know how different decisions lead to different types of results. And that's going to change the way people look at organizations. And that knowledge isn't going to come all at once in a nicely packaged form. It's going to come in bits and pieces, packaged and theorized by various people, all in the form of ideas and insights. And it's going to be our role as business leaders and people who are educated in the way things work to make sense of it, to translate it into profit, and to translate it also into ways of making a better world. Okay? So no pressure. The problem for us is not going to be too little information. The problem is going to be too much information and figuring out which parts of it and which combinations of it and which packages of it are actually worth paying attention to and how we might pay attention to them. And I learned this myself firsthand. Oh, these two slides basically were things I was going to say. So the Renaissance approaching us, there's a lot we could say about artificial intelligence. I'm kind of going to skip it and say it's going to be really important. Most of the rote business activities can be done by algorithm. Things that people do now as part of their work will be increasingly done by machines. But that, I actually honestly don't believe that's going to mean jobs are going to be eliminated. What I think is going to happen is that companies are going to be more and more competitive at what they do, and therefore become more sophisticated in the ways in which they use data, and that's going to require more people with more insight rather than less. There's a certain level of creative insight that machines will not duplicate, and as they do move into business activity, that will become more important. So business will compete, as it says there at the bottom, based on the things that can't be reduced to an algorithm. Insights about customers, insights about employees, and insights about relationships among people. So every decision is a bet on some theory about the way the world works, and there will always be a way to get an edge. And increasingly, the ability to accomplish this will depend on your capacity for taking it all in and making sense of it. Hence, you're here. Okay, so I learned all this firsthand. Those are like all the slides with words that I have on this whole deck, pretty much. Actually, that's not true, but those are the only slides where I took myself by surprise, I hope. About 2 years ago, the magazine I edit, which is called Strategy and Business, published we hit our 20th anniversary. And so for the 20th anniversary issue, we decided we were going to do a kind of interactive piece about the history of management ideas. We were going to do a big genealogy chart. And so we invited 10 eminent management historians to come to a big room with Post-it notes about the important ideas in the history of management. We had the idea that in about a 7-hour period, we were going to put them all up on the wall, organize them, and end up with a great big genealogy chart. Of course, we got up to, after 7 hours had gone by, and we were still putting the Post-it notes up on the wall. And it looked kind of like that. And we sat and stewed and thought and stewed and mulled. And we ultimately decided that this was too complicated to organize as a genealogy chart of ideas, but we could organize it by something that mattered more. We realized that every business idea is an answer to a question, and that most business ideas, in fact, have emerged as hypotheses for answering questions that had very strong practical value. So we came up with 20 questions, and we had ultimately about 500 ideas, and we grouped the most interesting and important of the ideas under those questions, and we published an article, which I'll also make sure is available on your website, called 20 Questions what did we call it? We called it 20 Questions of Management, 20 Questions for Business Leaders. And we thought we did a pretty cool job of grouping them, and in the process, we discovered that some of these answers, all of these answers were interesting, and all of them were most interesting for the way in which they affected business decision makers. In other words, none of these answers are the answer in themselves, but they are all powerful because they reflect, once you have them, you can begin to act and apply them to your situation and make a difference. And so, I don't have time to talk. I have 19 minutes left. And I don't have time to talk about 500 answers. But I have time to talk about 5. So I'm going to talk about the 5 that I think are cool. And then I'll try to limit myself to about 3 minutes for each one. And these are not the 5 coolest ones. These are just the ones that resonate personally for me. And the point of doing this is not to say these are the 5 answers you need to think about, but to show how interesting business ideas can be as you evolve over time, and how behind every sort of seemingly rote business idea, there's a really interesting story. Not everyone, but a lot of them. So here are the 5 that I sort of think are cool. Or here are 5 of the many that I think are cool. And I'll open by showing you the question that we tag them with. So for instance, how do we win? Big question, strategy. How does this company overcome its competitors and create a place in the industry? Michael Porter's 5 Forces is an answer to this question. Execution is an answer to this question. Henry Mintzberg's idea of the manager, core competencies is an answer. Becoming a monopoly is an answer. Diversification is an answer. Letting 1,000 flowers bloom, that's Henry Mintzberg. But the answer that we developed in our book Strategy That Works, which came out about last year that I worked on. One way for a company to win, to succeed over and over again in the marketplace, is to differentiate itself, to do something that no other company can do. And to do it so consistently well and so consistently effectively that you get better and better at doing your own, at having your own distinctive identity and the capabilities needed to deliver on the value proposition that only you can do. So for instance, Starbucks. Okay. I've noticed that there's at least 1, 5, 12 Starbucks in the Quad Cities. 132. Every Starbucks is different from every other Starbucks, and yet every Starbucks is Starbucks. They all borrowed from the Italian barista tradition, but not entirely. They all have the same ambiance, but not exactly. They all have one thing in common that no other store does as well, which is they have this third place identity where people can go when they're not at work and not at home and feel reasonably comfortable and deliver that at a profit. Right? Anybody can create a third place, but to make it consistent around the world and deliver it at a profit is an immense capability, and that's Starbucks' value proposition. No other company can do that. No other company can do what IKEA does in creating furniture and selling it in a way that, at consistently low prices and somehow beguiling people into assembling it themselves. No other company can do what Amazon does. No other company can do what Qualcomm, the company that developed the technology inside cellular telephony, can do. Lots of Chinese companies are trying right now, but none of them can do it. That's because these companies have figured out something that they can do effectively. They have focused their efforts on it, and they make sure before they try something new, and Amazon is always trying something new, that it is something that fits who they are and what they can do. And, so for example, Starbucks quite famously introduced a grill in their stores around 2001 and ultimately abandoned it. That was one of the reasons Howard Schultz came back to be CEO again, because they realized that grilling food in the store made the place smell like cheese. And you can't have a third place. You just don't want to sit around in a living room that smells like grilled cheese. Not after a couple of hours. So they abandoned it. That is an example of how do we win. And the corollary to that is that you have to be incredibly ruthless if you're going to follow that strategy. This is not a strategy for the faint of heart. This is a strategy. This is like somebody who really knows who they are and dedicates themselves to being who they are, to the point where you say, how could someone be that obsessive about their identity? And then, years later you discover that person has realized something. Well, it applies to companies as well. Okay, so that's one example of an answer to a question. Powerful answer. If you have a company, you don't necessarily have to do this, but if you're not asking yourself, when you're chasing a new business or a new opportunity, is this something I can do better than just about anybody else? Then you're taking a big risk with your strategy. And if you get in the habit of answering, is this something I can be great at? Is this something I can be distinctive at? Is this something I can differentiate myself with? Then that becomes internalized. Okay, that was idea one. Another big question that people ask is, what's the best way to do the work? In other words, how do I actually get the factory organized and do orient production and all that? How many people here have some experience with lean manufacturing or the quality movement or lean production, anything of that sort? Okay, so people are sort of like, they're putting up their hands the way I would put up my hands. Yeah, I know, it's kind of, we know it's important and I've sort of seen it and, but do I really know it? Well, those who really know it know that so there's, this is also known as the Japanese manufacturing system, the Toyota production system. I met somebody who was here earlier today, was the head of quality at John Deere, and he lived and breathed it, and people who really get into it live and breathe this method. It's a series of tools and techniques. By tools I mean management, I mean like instruments that you use when you're in production to sort of get to the cause of a problem. One of them is called the 5 whys. This is one of the simplest ones. You see a problem, there's water dripping down from the ceiling. Well, why is there water from the ceiling? Well, there's, a valve that hasn't been fixed. Well, why hasn't the valve been fixed? Because, we don't have the part. Well, why don't you have the part? Because our procurement system is screwed up. And why is your procurement system screwed up? Because we haven't revamped our procurement systems. Why is there water dripping down from the floor? Because we haven't revamped our procurement systems. Why haven't we noticed that before? Because we haven't had the discipline to take stock of these problems. We've let them go as problems. We have not paid attention to our processes in a concerted, organized way, using every tool at our disposal, including the statistical analysis of the difference between common causes, which happen all the time, and specialized causes, which happen only when there's a crisis. We have not continuously improved our efforts. We have not become one with the production. It's not a coincidence that the quality movement developed in Japan. It's a very Zen way. To use Zen in a very loose way, it's a very Zen way of becoming fully aware, of becoming one with the production through these methods that seem like they seem like statistical process control, and they seem very hard-nosed. But the point of it is in everybody from the CEO to the new entrant on the shop floor, developing that kind of awareness that allows the production to meld with their minds. And when you have a whole organization of people doing this, you become extraordinarily successful, like Honda and Toyota, like Danaher, which is one of the most successful instrument makers in the world, and like John Deere. And when you lose sight of it, when you let yourself slip from this intensive awareness, everything slips around you. So that's idea number 2. And just about every manufacturing company has adopted, that's any good, has adopted some form of lean production for that reason. But the companies that instill it in their management practices and the way they learn and the way they revitalize themselves are really special. Okay, and that's W. Edwards Deming, who was the sort of one of probably the single leading person in avatar, acolyte, leader, the single leading leader of our understanding of quality. Okay, here's a really cool one, right? A question that nobody ever asks. How can I possibly get everything done? And there are a lot of answers that range from making lists to ration your email to, you can't, to all sorts of, techniques, sort of like diets. Let's try the next time-save diet. That'll work. The last 12 didn't, but this one will. And the best answer to this comes from a New Yorker writer named Adam Gopnik, who wrote an article about 12 years ago called "Looking for Mr. Ravioli." And it was written when his daughter was 3 years old, so she's probably really embarrassed by this article now, because it was about her imaginary friend, Charlie Ravioli. And, Gopnik lives in New York, and so her daughter's imaginary friend was always too busy to play with her. She would be talking to her friend, and she would say, she'd pretend to call him on her cell phone. And she'd say, "Ravioli, it's Olivia, come and play." "Okay, call me then when you have time." And he was always, she'd have to stumble into him and have lunch with him, and then she'd get to see him, or, he'd cancel play dates with her. This is her imaginary friend. And then her imaginary friend got a secretary who was scheduling calls so that she could see him. And her parents are looking at her and saying, do we have a child with a personality disorder? And then they realized that she was mimicking the behavior of all the adults that she was seeing, including both of them. So Gopnik, being a very skilled journalist, decided that he would investigate busyness. And he's a kind of a literary scholar, and so he started looking at literature. And here's what he wrote. He wrote, "Business long predates busyness. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when bourgeois people were building the institutions of busy life, they seem never to have complained that they were too busy, or if they did, they left no record of it. Samuel Pepys, in the 18th century, who had a navy to refloat and a burned London to rebuild, never complained of being busy. For him, busy was a synonym for being happy, not being stressed. Hey, I'm busy." All of that changes, says Gopnik, by the end of the 19th century. Virginia Woolf is always complaining about having to race across London. And Henry James complains about being busy all the time. And, there's Mark Twain and a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is all about this incredibly busy person suddenly landing in the middle of the medieval era. What changed? Anybody know what changed between Samuel Pepys and Virginia Woolf? The railroad, the telegraph, the telephone, and then the automobile. If you want to be less busy, know fewer people. If you think it's worth it. There may be no other cure, no other way to accomplish it. And, okay, I now have 4 minutes and 34 seconds, but I'm going to use an extra 5 minutes, so I'm going to do 2 more. What the hell is leadership is one of the other questions we ask. Now this one is very personal for me because I've been working with a neuroscientist named Jeffrey Schwartz and an executive coach from Australia named Josie Thompson on a theory of our own, a business idea of our own, which we call the high road and the low road. And here's a little diagram of it. You can see that there's a loop on the top and a loop on the bottom. These loops represent patterns of mental activity and brain circuits that kind of are aligned with them. You know, the pattern of mental activity is really where the action happens, and the brain circuit sort of follows along and gets imprinted by the mental activity, as it always does. So, if you're a leader who really wants to accomplish something with your organization, who really wants to make a difference, well, you can go along and do, you know, you can like please people, sell customers, make good deals, do great work, you know, and we call that the low road. Because you're doing transactional work, your organization is doing transactional work, and and you're succeeding. You may well be profiting. But if you want to take your organization across a threshold and do things that weren't possible before, for example, if you're, you know, an automobile manufacturer dealing with the advent of the autonomous vehicle, or you're an educational institution or an accounting firm wondering how artificial intelligence is going to affect you, or you're a record producing company or a recording company in the age of Spotify, you may have to transcend your limits a little bit and get out of your comfort zone. And then you want to have the pattern that allows you to think differently as a leader. And it turns out that there are mental habits that trigger these two patterns. And the more habits change the brain. So the more you practice a habit, the easier it becomes to practice that habit over and over again. That's what attention density is. When you pay attention to something, it becomes easier and easier. And so, if you want to trigger the high road, and when the head is upright, these two circuits, the brain parts aspects of these two circuits are literally, one is sort of above the other. The high road is above the low road. And if you want to trigger the high road, the two practices that you develop, according to the literature, as we understand it, are mindfulness and mentalizing. Mindfulness is becoming more aware of your own thinking. People often do that through meditation, although there are other ways to do it as well. Mentalizing is also called having a theory of mind, and psychologists discovered this with autistic people. For most people, if you look at a photograph of someone, you can guess pretty well what they were thinking when that photograph was taken. It's uncanny but true. However, autistic people cannot. They do not have the facility to guess accurately from a picture what somebody is thinking. Mentalizing is the act of thinking about what somebody else is thinking and what they are likely to do. And leaders who are mindful and mentalize develop the ability to look at themselves as if someone else was looking at them and use that guidance to help them understand how somebody else would see what they're doing. Right? You know how you may have had a boss at one time or another where you said, if he could or she could only see that behavior the way somebody else would see it. Well, mentalizing and mindfulness give you the ability to do that. Interestingly enough, mentalizing is associated with low status. People who have relatively low status of any form are more likely to mentalize. So for example, an administrative assistant is much more likely to mentalize about the boss than the boss is to mentalize about the administrative assistant. I know, I'm over. And therefore, the paradox of mentalizing is just when a leader needs most to be strategic, the leader is apt to think, well, I've gotten up to this level of an organization, I've paid my dues, I don't need to think about anybody anymore, they're tired to mentalize about me. And that's when the leader's ability atrophies, or so we think. So that's answer number 4. And then answer number 5 is to the question, how can we fulfill our potential? And I'll just very quickly tell you about Elliot Jax's theory that made him say, I get it, and you don't get it, you eminent people out there. Elliot Jax went around the world studying felt fair pay. Felt fair pay is what you think other people should be worth who work with you. Okay, so, and it turns out that there's 95% correlation. Like if we all worked in the same office, and you asked any of us what somebody else was worth, like who was worth more than somebody else, you would find 95% agreement. To the point where you can correlate the felt fair pay, not the real pay. You know, somebody might say, well, you know, I should be making, you know, $100,000, I'm making $80,000. Somebody else might say, I should be making $80,000, but I'm making $100,000. That, you know, it's what people feel you are worth. He looked for correlates to that. And he finally found it in the time span, which is the amount of time that you can send somebody to do a task before they're going to have to check in with you to get further instructions. People, and it turns out that time span correlates with cognitive complexity, and this correlates with levels of a hierarchy, and that correlates with the evolution of people's capacity over the course of their lives. So all of us start with a certain, you know, innate level of time span, a certain innate level of cognitive complexity. And Jax argued that every 15 years or so, well, every 15 years, unless we're stunted by circumstance, we cross a level of cognitive complexity and move to the next level, which means we would then be comfortable at the next level of the hierarchy. So he had this like organizational side and personal side, and if they mesh, then it's like the golden mean. You feel like everything's right. But if you're at a level of the hierarchy that's too high for your level of cognitive complexity, you always feel like you're out of your league a little bit, like you're faking it, like that old Paul Simon song. And if you're at a level below your level of cognitive complexity, you'll always feel frustrated, like you're not recognized for what you can actually do. A happy organization, a truly happy organization, is one that has just enough levels to mimic the various levels of complexity. And if you've ever had the feeling, if you've ever suddenly realized, my gosh, I'm doing things that I couldn't have imagined myself doing just a few years ago, and now they're suddenly like second nature to me. Jax might say, you have crossed that level of cognitive complexity. You've advanced a level. Wouldn't it be nice if the world was structured that way? And Jax devoted most of his life, and he had quite a number of loyal followers, and still does, who have been trying to create what they call requisite organizations, which are organizations that are structured according to human interest, human capability. So, these are cool, right? And we could go on and talk a lot more about each of these ideas or many more ideas. The point is that we're in a time when management is probably the place where ideas are most alive and where they are having the greatest test of their efficacy and applicability. And those of us who are in business making them work are not just making a living, not just making a profit, not just making the world a better place, but making our own understanding and the understanding of everybody else come alive. So I think this group is great. And with that, we probably have a minute or two for questions if there are any.
Questions? You're all students, come on.
I know you're stunned by this rapid fire trip through the world of ideas, but if you will. Woman in gray in the back row. We're going to bring you a microphone.
So when you were talking about the mentalizing, or mentalization, I can't remember, you said as you move up the ladder, you kind of lose that skill. Are there ways you can kind of get back to it and improve that?
You bet. And we have a book called The High Road Less Traveled, which will be talking about that. And we did an article. There are steps you can take, and it's, you know, it's like anything else, like weightlifting. It's a discipline that you have to decide to practice because you want to be a strategic leader. One of the things I didn't say is that you develop in your mind a kind of a wise advocate, you know, a part of your mind that you consult for guidance. And then if you carry that forward enough, you begin to play that same role in your organization. You become the person that people turn to when they say, you know, how are we going to do this impossible thing? Because you're naturally thinking that way. Man in, oh, sorry, here and then there.
Are mentalizing and mindfulness related to emotional intelligence?
Mindfulness, as practiced, is one of the ways that people develop emotional intelligence, which Daniel Goleman, who wrote in Emotional Intelligence, you know, says quite adamantly. Mentalizing, which is the ability to look at people and say, you know, which is the habit, the action of asking yourself, what is that person likely to do and why and what are they thinking? I'm a really good mentalizer, and my emotional intelligence is kind of so-so. I don't think they're correlated. There was a question back there.
Does this theory that you've described apply universally worldwide? My experience has been the North American paradigm that I had in my job that then became international. That paradigm did not hold, and we had to learn new skills in dealing with people from different cultures, whether it was Russia, India, China, South Africa, South America, Australia. There were distinct differences. So with your 20-question theory, have you tested it from a cultural standpoint? Is there a cultural bias, or can this be universally applied in any environment?
That question would have to be answered individually for each of the 5 theories that I mentioned. In the case of Elliot Jax's theory, the one about felt fair pay and cognitive complexity, he did travel around the world testing it in many countries, including India, South Africa, Australia, other Asian countries. I don't remember which ones, Eastern Europe. He was adamant about that. He was a kind of a insistent. The one that I just mentioned about mindfulness and mentalizing, not so much. You know, we haven't really tested it anywhere. But what we can say is universal. So I don't know. And it's a fair question. But what we can say is universal is the idea that habits of mental activity change the physiological makeup of the brain, and therefore where you place your attention at a moment of decision becomes habitual. It may take a different form in different cultures, but that's universal. That's been shown to be accurate in tests. And one of the papers that we're working on is based on meditators' experience in China, both Buddhist and Christian meditators in China, and what happens with them. But no, this last one is very much a hypothesis. And each one of these theories has varying degrees of universal applicability, and that's what makes them living in a way. I mean, you could say that's arguably a problem, and it is, But it also means that for a business, when you decide this is a theory I'm going to base my business on, you are in effect becoming an experimenter. And the world is your control group.
I have a question about how is it with the different ideas that all of us have probably thought about, not only during your talk, but throughout the program when we were getting our MBA and afterwards. How do we bring those ideas to organizations that, based on your slides, are wanting 16th century medicine and we show up with 21st century technology?
Well, speaking as someone who edits a fairly visible magazine in an organization of 240,000 people that acquired that magazine through an acquisition, I live that every day. And I'm fortunate because, you know, there's been a basic level of respect and appreciation for what the magazine does and for what it can do, and a lot of what the magazine does is counterintuitive to the traditional way that PwC has done things in the past. And so early on I decided, well, first of all, I do kind of try to play the role of wise advocate. I do try to keep aware of how I would look to other people, including those who might disagree with what I have to say. What are they thinking? What are they likely to do next? What do I really have to do to establish my credibility with them? And then I decided early on that I was not going to be anxious. And in talking to the other people, like-minded people on my team or elsewhere, I started using the phrase insouciant savoir-faire. In other words, we weren't going to be anxious, and we were going to be even lighthearted. When we did something countercultural, we were going to be lighthearted about it. Not glib, not, you know, not superficial, but lighthearted, not anxious. We would have the assumption that if it was truly something of value, everybody would naturally want to do it because it would be truly of value. And we would be backed up, that's the insouciant part. And then the savoir-faire part is we would know what we were doing. We wouldn't make dumb mistakes. We would, you know, cross our T's and dot our I's and really prepare. And that combination has worked for me and for others that I've seen. Best answer I can give.
I was so interested when you started speaking about looking at people's faces and knowing what they were thinking, because I just a few days ago sat in a room of educators who also happen to be doctors who were talking about the importance of training empathy or educating about empathy, and the way to do was to look at faces and understand what they were feeling. And I wondered if you would maybe draw parallels in business about maybe the value of looking at people and understand what they're feeling as maybe being valuable as business leaders.
Well, there's 3 or 4 things to say, and I don't, while I'm insouciant, I don't have savoir-faire about any of them. So first of all, the ability to look at a picture and know what someone is thinking or guess what someone is thinking and be reasonably accurate, I think is different than looking at a picture. Well, it is the same, what someone is thinking or feeling. That is something people do. Mentalizing is an action, and empathy is a quality, an attribute that people have. And it's likely, although I can't say for sure, it's possible that the act of mentalizing raises people's empathy. In other words, it's possible that you can train yourself to be more empathetic. But you asked about the value of empathy. As business leaders. So, all other factors being equal, it's almost certainly better to be empathetic than not to be empathetic. But a really good business leader is that are problematic for the individuals in the group. A really good example, I've been through this twice now, is an extensive set of layoffs. There are organizations where, layoffs are really damaging because they hurt the capabilities. But there are organizations where, they're top-heavy. And there are and 30% of the people are spending most of their time managing another 30% of the people. And when you finally lay people off, when you finally reduce the size of the organization, you discover that it's not just more, it's not just cheaper. You haven't just saved money. You've made the whole place come alive. And people feel it and they know it, especially if you lay off the right 30%, the people who weren't really happy to be there in the first place. That sounds cruel and harsh. And if you have a certain level of empathy, it's not going to happen. Because you're going to recognize that you're going to be empathetic for people's immediate needs. You're going to be thinking about what people want as opposed to what they're thinking and what they're likely to do. You're going to be in touch with pleasing people as opposed to doing the thing that is best for the whole system. And it's very hard to have that kind of to have that kind of judgment in the best of times. A genuinely strategic leader needs to develop that kind of judgment, to know when to forgive and when to condemn, to know when to cut and when to expand. And there are no rule books. Empathy may or may not get in the way. And so if you're going to have empathy, if you're going to cultivate empathy, then you also have to cultivate the discernment to know when and how and where to apply that empathy. I wouldn't want to not have empathy. There are people on my team who are struggling now with things that they can't help. Issues, every manager, every leader has situations like that, where on one hand, the right decision is to let someone go. On the other hand, the right decision is to build a cocoon around them and protect them. And they may or may not see the same thing, see the circumstance the way I do. Empathy helps, but up to a point. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for that kind of leadership.
I think we have time for one more question.
These are great questions, by the way. Honestly, I can't say how much I've learned just at this talk and the one before it, just from the opportunity to engage with you on this kind of thing.
I'm going to use that as the point for the question, okay?
Okay.
I'm going to take you up on that.
Uh-oh.
What did you learn by coming here and talking with us?
Aw, gee. Well, partly I go into a trance, so it's hard for me to remember exactly. I mean, I'll know it when I sort it out later. That's not as much of a dodge as it may seem.
It certainly seems dodgy.
It's not a very practiced dodge. But well, it was very interesting to me. So just one thing was, the caliber of questions, right? The first few questions here tonight about, this last theory, the one about neuroscience and mentalizing and mindfulness, showed, as I often find, that the level of sophistication about leadership that people naturally have is pretty high. That people recognize. You didn't ask, why do we have to worry about this? You asked instead, how do we know that this is truly effective? That's, that was powerful for me. The question about, does this apply to other countries, reminded me of just how comfortable I am climbing out on an intellectual limb sometimes and not necessarily looking down. So I'm going to tell you a story, and then that'll show you. One of the very first articles I did for Strategy and Business, I was a writer there for 5 years before I became editor. One of the very first stories I did was about the differences between cultural values. And it was a profile of two people, Franz Trompenaars and Charles Hampton Turner. And it was about the cultural differences that are embedded so deeply that you can survey people about them and you'll find different answers. And so Trompenaars and Hampton Turner would ask this question. They would say, imagine that you are driving a car. You're a passenger and your friend is driving a car and your friend is drunk and your friend hits a pedestrian. And the police come to you the next day and they ask you, was your friend drunk? What is the honorable and ethical thing to do? And the answer varies considerably by country, by culture, by nationality. So for example, in the United States, the answer is, well, you tell the truth. You tell the police, my friend was drunk, because that is the ethical thing to do. In Russia, you absolutely lie. My friend was not drinking because, loyalty to your friend is paramountly important and the police are not trustworthy and therefore, the moral ethical thing to do is to lie to the police. In the United Kingdom, it depends on what happened to the pedestrian. If the pedestrian died, then it's really serious and you'd better tell the police the truth. In France, it also depends on what happened to the pedestrian. If the pedestrian died, then your friend needs you more than ever. It's really serious, and the moral thing to do is to lie. In Italy, it depends on what happened to the car. That's Franz Trompenaars' line, not mine, but the really interesting one was Japan. And this to me is a true management idea. And hearing this transformed my view of morality forever. It may not, I know that now the pressure's on, it may not do that for yours, but it transformed mine. In Japan, there are two valuable solutions to this problem, okay? You're riding in the car, your friend was drunk, you hit a pedestrian, he hits a pedestrian or she, police come to you. You tell the police you get back to them later and you go to your friend and you say one of two things. You say either, okay, I am going to the police and I am going to tell them that you were guilty. But I was there with you, and so I am going to dedicate myself to making sure that you get a fair trial, that you have good legal representation, and that you're treated well by the system. Or you go to your friend and say, I'm going to lie, and I'm going to say that you were not drinking, but you're going to clean up your life right now. I'm going to make sure you go to rehab, that you never drink and drive again, and I'm going to be on you like a hawk for the rest of our lives together. And on some level, that to me, oh, this is so glib. On some level, that to me is a metaphor for management ideas altogether. Organizations, some organizations are big, some organizations are small, but the organization as we know it is a creature of the Industrial Revolution. They're like toddlers compared to most institutions in human history. Invisible toddlers walking around causing all sorts of things. And we who understand about management are helping these toddlers behave. And so we are responsible. We've got to kind of watch them like hawks. Fortunately, it's pleasant to do that most of the time, if you have the right level of insouciance savoir-faire. So thank you.
Thank you very much.